Hello everyone, in this video we'll create an integration to understand the use of global variables and data stitch to handle object and array of object in OIC. Now what is global variable and data stitch? So the global variable is a variable that is accessible throughout an entire integration including all scopes and actions. They can store various data types including complex object types as well. Whereas data stitch is an action which is used to assign or append the values in the global variables. Now for this integration, we need this source data file where we have the invoice data like invoice ID, invoice number, invoice amount with supplier ID of the invoice. And as the output file, we need this data along with one more column which is supplier name for each invoice. And for that, we'll read this file within OIC, and then for each invoice, we'll get the supplier name using the REST API by passing the supplier ID as parameter, and then prepare the data for our output file using global variable and data stitch. Now I will go to OIC, and under connections, you can see three connections are there that we'll use for our integration. Here the REST 001 is a trigger connection which will be used to trigger the integration with source file name and file path. We are not providing anything in this connection. Then we have the FTP connection FTP 001 where we have provided the FTP server host address, port, username, password, and under optional properties the SFTP connection as yes. The connection will be used to read the file from SFTP. The last connection is REST connection REST 002 which will be used to get the supplier name from ERP. Here you have to choose the connection type as REST API base URL, and in the connection URL you have to provide the ERP URL. And under security we have provided one ERP username and password. Now I'll go to integrations and click on the create button to create our integration. I'll choose application integration and provide the name as intg018 as this is our 18th integration. Now I'll click on create. Here I'll search with REST and choose REST 001 which is our triggered connection. I'll provide the endpoint name as request and continue. Now for the endpoint relative resource URI, I'll provide slash and I'll choose the action as post. Now for the request payload, I'll check the checkbox of configure a request payload for this endpoint. Now continue. Now I'll go down and I'll click on inline to provide our request payload. Here I have provided the source file path with the file name. So while we trigger the integration, then we'll provide this file path and file name. Now continue, continue, finish. I'll make it horizontal. Now we'll read the source data file from the SFTP, and for that I'll open WinSCP and upload our source data file into one of the SFTP folder. Now I'll click on the plus and search for FTP connection, that is FTP001. So I'll select this. I'll provide the name as read file. Continue, continue. Now as we want to read the file from SFTP, so the operation will be read a file which is already selected. Now for the input directory I'll provide slash and file name I'll provide star. I'll provide this value in the mapping. Continue. Now we have to provide the schema of the source file. So for that I'll continue, and here we'll upload our source data file schema. So I'll click on drag and drop and choose our source data file. For the record name I'll provide R, and for the record set I'll provide RS. Now I'll go down. I'll check the checkbox of column options to make all the columns as optional. Then I'll choose the first column as mandatory. Now I'll continue, finish. Now I'll go to the read file map, and under the file read request we have to provide the file name and directory. So from the sources I'll expand request wrapper and map file path with the directory and file name with the file name. We'll provide this value when we trigger the integration. Now validate. Now go back. Now we want to get the supplier name for each invoice using the REST API, and for that we have to use a for loop, and within that will pass the supplier ID to get the supplier name for each invoice. So I'll click on plus and search for each. So I'll select the for each, and here I will expand the read file, and under the read file response I can see the repeating element R that will provide in the for each repeating element. Now I'll save this. Now here we have to use the REST API to get the supplier name. So for that I'll click on the plus and search for REST, and I'll choose the connection REST 002 that will be used to get the supplier name. I'll provide the name as get supplier name. Now to get the endpoint of the supplier, we'll search with REST API for suppliers, and I'll go to the first link. You can see this is the page of REST API for Oracle Fusion Cloud Procurement. Now I'll go down, and in the bottom of this page you can see suppliers, and as we are getting the supplier name for each supplier ID one at a time within the for loop, so I'll click get one supplier. So you can see this is the endpoint to get one supplier. So I'll copy this and paste in the endpoint relative resource URI. Now in the endpoint you can see supplier ID is there, which is a query parameter, and in this query parameter we'll pass the supplier ID from our source data file for each invoice to get the supplier name. An action will be get, which is already selected. Now you can see here the checkbox of review parameters is already selected as we are passing one query parameter, and as this is a get action, so we cannot check the checkbox of request payload. And for the response we want the supplier name, and for that I'll check the checkbox of the response. Now I'll continue. I'll go down, and for the supplier ID instead of string I'll choose integer. Now continue. Now here we have to configure the response. So for that I'll click on inline. Now I'll go to the REST API page and go down. Now in the example response body, you can see to get the supplier we have to use this attribute which is supplier. So I'll copy this, and within curly braces I'll paste it. So this is the sample supplier name. You can also make it blank. Now I'll continue. Here we have to remove the comma. Now continue, finish. Now to get the output file in the SFTP, I'll click on the plus and search for FTP, and I'll choose FTP 001. Here I'll provide the name as write file to FTP. Continue. Now instead of read a file, I'll choose write file. For the output directory I'll provide slash, and for the file name pattern I'll provide star. These are dummy values. I'll provide the values in the mapping. Now continue. Now here we have to provide the schema of the output file, and for that we have created one file which is supplier_invoice data. In this file you can see all the columns from the source data file are present along with the supplier name column. So I'll continue and upload this file. For the record name I'll provide W, and for the record set I'll provide WS. Now I'll go down. I'll make all the columns as optional and choose the first column as mandatory. Now continue and finish. Now I'll go to the map of write file to SFTP, and I will expand the outbound FTP header type. Here we have to provide the file name and directory. So I'll expand the request wrapper, and I want to write the file in the same directory of the source file. So that is why I'll map the file path to directory, and I'll click on the file name and choose create target node. Here I'll use a concat function for the file name. So within concat I'll write supplier, then I'll put comma, and after that I'll provide source file name. Now I'll save this. Now for the write file data I'll expand WS, and under the repeating element W we have to map the fields to pass the value, but under sources we don't have any repeating element or array to get these values together. If we expand the read file response, then we can see under the repeating element R we have the fields except the supplier name, as we are getting that from the REST API. So we need an array of object where we can store the value of these fields with supplier name, and for that we'll create global variable and use data stitch. So I'll go back, and in the right hand side just below the action icon we have an icon global variable. So I'll click on that and click on the plus icon to create the global variable. Here I'll provide the name as v underscore data underscore obj, which is object. And under the types, you can choose different types, which are string, boolean, date, date time, number, but I'll choose object. Now from the input sources, I'll expand the write file to FTP request to get the object. Now in this global variable object type, I want to store all these 5 fields which are under W. So that is why I'll drag the W into the type. As under W, we have 5 elements. That means now this global variable can store one value at a time for each 5 elements. Now I'll save. Now I'll go to for each and click on plus. Here I'll search for data stitch and you can see the action data stitch. I'll choose this action. Now for the variable, I'll click on the switch to developer view and for the value I'll do the same. Now you can see our global variable object that we just created, which is v underscore data underscore obj. So I'll expand this and expand the W. Now in all these fields, we have to assign the values that we are getting within the for each iteration. So I'll drag the first variable, which is invoice ID, and for the value, I'll expand the for each, that is f0 underscore r. And under the r, we can see the fields. So I'll expand invoice ID. So now under the data stitch object, the invoice ID is assigned with the value from for each. Now I'll click on plus and then under the variable, I'll drag the invoice number from the global variable. And for the value, I'll get this invoice number from the for each. I'll do the same for invoice amount and supplier ID as well. Now the last variable is supplier name. For that, I'll again click on the plus and in the variable, I'll drag the supplier name from the global variable object. And now the value of the supplier name will not get from the for each, rather will get from the REST API. So for that, I'll go up and you can see get supplier name. So I'll expand this and for the supplier name, I'll drag the supplier into the value. Now all the 5 fields of the global variable object is now assigned with the value. But please note that each field of this object can store only one value at a time. That means all these fields can store the values of that particular iteration and in the next iteration, the values will be updated. So to store all these values, we'll need one array of objects where we can append these object values for each iteration. So for that, I'll save and create one more global variable and which will be a array of object. So I'll provide the name as v underscore data underscore obj arr, which is for array, and I'll choose the type as object. Now I'll expand the write file to FTP request, and to make it as array of object, I'll drag the ws into the type. As the repeating element w is under the ws, so that means it will become an array of object. Now I'll save. Now to store all the values in that global variable array of object, I'll use one more data stitch. So I'll click on plus and search for data. So I'll choose the action data stitch and now I'll click on the switch to developer view and this is our global variable array object. I'll expand this. Now I want to store all the values in the repeating element w, so I'll drag this into the variable. And now instead of assign, we'll choose the operation as append. As we want to append the values that is coming from the for each into this array of object. And for the value, I'll expand our previous global variable object. And here you are storing the value for each iteration in the W. So I'll drag this into the value. So now for each iteration, all the values will be assigned to these 5 fields and that will be append to our array of object. And in the next iteration, this object will be updated with the new values and those new values will be appended into our array of object. So that is how we can store all the values into our array of object and which is referred by the global variable vData object arr. Now it is done. I'll save this. Now as our array with all the values are ready, so we can map this to our write file to get the values into our output file. So I'll edit the write file to SFTP map and I'll expand the WS, and from the sources I'll expand our global variable array of object. First of all, I'll map the repeating element W to W and then map all the fields like invoice ID, invoice num, invoice amount, supplier ID, and supplier name. Now validate. Now go back. Now the last thing is we have to add one primary business identifier. So I'll expand the request wrapper and drag the file name to the business identifier field. I'll save this. Now we are ready to activate and run our integration. So I'll activate this integration. Now I'll run the integration. Here I'll provide the file path and file name. For that I'll go to WinSCP and copy the file path. I'll copy the file name as well and paste it. Now I'll click on the run button. Now we are getting one error while we are calling the REST API as we missed out the mapping to pass the supplier ID. So I'll close this. Now I'll deactivate this integration and click on edit. Now I'll go to the map of get supplier name and I'll expand the template parameter, and in the sources I'll expand the reference of for each, which is f0_r. Now I'll map the supplier ID to supplier ID. Now again I'll activate and run the integration. So I'll click on the run button. Now you can see processing completed successfully, and in the for each you can see 11 iterations are there as we have 11 invoices in our source data file, and all the iterations are successful. Now I'll go to the SFTP and refresh. Now you can see our output file is generated, which is supplier invoice underscore data.csv. So I'll download this file and open it. Now you can see we are getting the data correctly, like all our source file data is present, as well as we are getting the supplier name for each invoices. But we are not getting the header. If we want to get the header, then we have to prepare that in the mapping. For that again we will edit our integration. Now I'll go to the map of write file to SFTP and I'll expand WS. First of all, I'll delete this target node. And for the header, for each field, we have to provide the column name. Like for invoice ID, I'll click on the create target node and I'll provide the column name as invoice ID. For invoice name, I'll click on the create target node and provide invoice number. I'll do the same for all the fields. Now we have provided the name of all the columns for the header. Now I'll click on the W and choose the repeat node option. So you can see one more node of W is created. So the first node is used for the header, and in the second node we'll map the values. So I'll expand the global variable array object, which is v_data_obj_arr, and create the same mapping. Now you can see it is done. Now I'll validate. Now again I'll activate and run the integration. So you can see the processing completed successfully. Now I'll go to WinSCP again and refresh. Now you can see the file is generated. Now I'll download it. Now I'll open this. Now you can see we are now getting the header with all the source file data as well as the supplier name for all the invoices. So this is it for this video. If you like this video, please hit the like button. Share this video within your circle. If you have any doubts or any suggestions, put that in the comment section and do subscribe our channel.